Hi, I'm Dr. Becky. I'm a registered psychologist, and in this video, I'm going to talk you through some of the most common psychological therapy approaches that are out there. I'm going to cover 13 different ones. There is a lot more out there, but in this video, I'm just going to give you a snippet of some of the more common approaches that you'll find when you're considering having psychological therapy. The first approach that I'm going to mention is cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT for short. Now, CBT is a very practical type of approach. So it's about looking at your cognitions, what goes through your mind, so thoughts or images, how that impacts your feelings, how that influences your behavior, and you want to also consider physical responses as well. So it's all about breaking cycles, and it offers various different techniques to help break cycles. So one example of a technique that's offered in CBT is cognitive restructuring, where you actually start to challenge and change the way you think in order to change your beliefs. And that's just one of many approaches in cognitive behavioral therapy. It is quite a manual based therapy in that when I trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, so I did like the gold standard training in the UK, which has a BA-BCP accreditation. And this was a really difficult training course. It was a bit like passing your driving test, as in there was a right way of doing it and there was a wrong way of doing it. And I did that course after my doctorate, so that was a year and a half long. And I have to say, personally, I found it more difficult than my doctorate because my doctorate was a lot more subjective in the way that we were tested on a lot of the different approaches out there. But when it comes to CBT, it is very black and white as to whether you're doing it right or wrong. And CBT for a long time was a big buzzword. It was very popular. So actually a lot of people were saying they were doing CBT and they'd never actually done the evidence-based therapy training. So be careful out there when people use the word CBT. Ask where they've done their training. And if they've done any less than a year of training in CBT, then they're not actually probably doing proper CBT, because it takes a long time to train in this approach in order to do it properly. It's really effective for anxiety and depression, but it doesn't necessarily conquer all anxiety and depression because there's no one approach that fits all. Approach number 2 is psychodynamic therapy, which is rooted in Freudian thinking, but is not exactly the therapy that he offered. It's evolved since then. It was very much about unconscious processes and how it relates to unresolved conflict. So with psychodynamic therapy, you look a lot at early childhood and relationship with primary caregivers, and then how that influences you in the here and now. It's not necessarily the most evidence-based therapy out there, as in there's not that much really good quality published research to say that time and time again it's consistently getting really good results for people. So it's quite exploratory. There's a lot of ideas in psychodynamics that are just ideas and suggestions from the therapist that they can't really back up with hard facts. So it's very much going on discovery with the client and making suggestions about how maybe, for example, the relationship with a mother or father might impact them in the here and now, but it's not an absolute given. So there's room for different types of interpretation with psychodynamic therapy. Approach number 3 is humanistic therapy. So humanistic therapy is very much on self-exploration and the client's own ability to actually come up with ideas themselves and come up with solving the problem themselves. So it's not a very directive type of therapy. You're not really guiding the client so much, and you're definitely not telling them what to do in this type of therapy. It's about really creating a space for the client to be able to come up with their own solutions, from being able to have that cathartic space of them speaking out loud. So Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy or client-centered therapy is one of the most common types of humanistic therapies out there. In this type of approach, you see the most common types of psychological therapy and counseling techniques being used, such as empathy, creating very safe space, and being very non-judgmental towards the client. Approach number 4 is cognitive analytic therapy, also known as CAT. CAT is an integrative approach which integrates cognitive behavioral therapy and psychoanalytic therapy all into one. So it's actually quite interesting in that it has a very much a here and now approach, and then also the deeper approach of a psychoanalytic approach coming together. So one technique that's commonly used in cognitive analytic therapy is a letter writing exercise that the therapist and the client work on together. And this letter writing exercise is usually the client writing a letter to themselves. And in this letter, they're talking about the challenges and also the recurring patterns that they face. And they write this in order to try to help them have really good self-awareness that will then help bring about change. Approach number 5 is Dialectical Behaviour Therapy, DBT for short. Now, DBT is a very interesting type of therapy, and it's often used with people with borderline personality disorder. But you don't necessarily have to have borderline personality disorder in order to have DBT. You might just have difficulties with regulating emotions. Some people who have self-harming behavior engage in DBT because it's very good at helping people tolerate distress in a better way. So one of the techniques that people learn in DBT, and DBT is very much about learning new techniques, is distress tolerance. So the distress tolerance technique that people learn in DBT is about helping people learn how to regulate their emotions much better. Approach number 6 is Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy. So Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy uses psychedelic substances to help process very deep emotions and create better insight. So this uses substances like psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, or MDMA, which is ecstasy, in order to help people process very deep and difficult emotions that they haven't already managed to process. And then, as I said, create better insight. So this is very good for trauma that people previously haven't been able to look at and haven't resolved. So this technique is not legal in every country. And it's very much about administering a controlled substance in a place where it's legal, and a fully trained therapist would administer that substance so that it's done in a very safe way. Approach number 7 is Existential Therapy. Now, Existential Therapy is about looking at the deeper meaning of various different aspects of life, such as dying or freedom, or other things that are bigger picture stuff that people might have a lot of questions about but don't have so many answers. So one technique that's used in existential therapy is getting the client to imagine dying so that they're actually able to evaluate their values and their priorities in life. Number 8 is Gestalt Therapy. Gestalt Therapy often helps people integrate conflicting parts of their personality and helps people gain better self-awareness and self-acceptance. So one technique that's commonly used in Gestalt Therapy is the empty chair technique. The empty chair technique is where you literally have a chair in front of you and you have conversations through the guidance of the therapist with another person who's not actually present, or it could be even conversations that you're having with yourself while looking at the empty chair and interacting with the empty chair as if there's a person sitting right in front of you. Approach number 9 is Movement Desensitisation Reprocessing, or EMDR for short. EMDR is a therapy that is mostly used for trauma, but it can work very well for anxiety as well. How it's said to work, but it's not completely known, is that it stimulates the left and the right hemisphere of your brain through bilateral stimulation, which is done usually through eye movements, but sometimes with tapping and sometimes with sounds. When you're having this therapy, your eyes will actually move, and it replicates REM eye movements that we have in sleep. Now, when we're asleep and we're dreaming, it's said that actually the REM eye movements that we're having is helping us process events from recent things that have happened, or actually things that have been traumatic that are much further in the past that we still haven't resolved. So essentially, we're trying to get someone to have these eye movements when they're awake in order to work on very targeted memories that they haven't yet resolved. It's a highly evidence-based therapy, so only psychotherapists, counselors, and psychiatrists and psychologists can train in this, as not to be confused with other less evidence-based therapies that might involve things such as tapping. And while it's most commonly used for trauma, it can often help with other things such as anxiety as well. Number 10 is systemic or family therapies. Systemic or family therapies look at patterns in relationships and dynamics between various different individuals, so that people actually gain awareness of what's going on, so then they can tweak and change their behavior, usually not just the behavior of an individual, but behaviors of several people, so that you can create more harmony and dynamics. So one common approach that's used with systemic or family therapies is the genogram. The genogram is a bit like drawing up a family tree, and it's about really understanding who is who in the family or in the relationship and what kind of dynamics are taking place between various different people. So it's a great way of not only the therapist understanding the setup of the family or the setup of the relationship, but actually it helps the client make sense of the dynamics and what's happening as well. Number 11 is integrative or eclectic therapy. In integrative or eclectic therapy, the therapist is completely free to combine whatever techniques they want often in a very free flowing state. So they're not labeling the technique and saying, now I'm doing CBT, now I'm doing psychodynamic. They basically are using the relationship with the client, and at various different times, they might draw on different approaches quite automatically in order to offer what might be best for the client. Occasionally, they might make the client aware of what approach they're using, but the integration often happens so naturally and so fluid with a very experienced therapist that they're not necessarily labeling it, and it's all coming together quite naturally. A good integrative therapist is very much going with their gut instinct, and a good integrative therapist is really focusing on building a very strong therapeutic relationship, because the therapeutic relationship is actually a huge indicator of whether someone will have a successful therapeutic outcome or not. Approach number 12 is mindfulness. So there's various different ways that you can integrate mindfulness into therapy. So you might have mindfulness-based CBT, which is often integrated in order to reduce the reoccurrence of depression, or you might have mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is aimed at helping people learn techniques that are mindfulness techniques. Or mindfulness-based stress reduction helps the client learn mindfulness techniques in order to reduce stress. Becoming effective at mindfulness techniques takes a lot of practice. It's like going to the gym. You get fitter and fitter the more you do it. At different times in your life, when you've been practicing mindfulness quite recently, you're probably going to be able to be a lot more present, although actually at times of emotional distress, even if you've been practicing a lot of mindfulness recently, you might not be the most present. So this is very similar to fitness in that some days you might have a bad day at the gym, even though you've been working out regularly, and you don't need to be hard on yourself because of that. So mindfulness is kind of the same. We're not supposed to judge ourselves so much for not being very mindful, as long as our intentions are to keep practicing and to keep coming back to it, and that actually some days we're going to have very good days where we're more present than others, and some days are going to be a bit tougher. And finally, number 13 is internal family systems. Now, internal family systems is a very interesting type of therapy that helps someone look at various different parts of themselves or sub-personalities in order to understand themselves and promote healing and change. So this suggests that actually we have different sides to us. We have different parts, almost like we have different personalities without us necessarily having a personality disorder. So it helps people speak to the different parts of themselves in order to achieve change. This approach often explores having different dialogues with various different parts of yourself. So for example, someone might have quite a childlike part, but they might have quite a mature part. So they're speaking to the very childlike part in order to bring that part up to speed so that actually it's more in line with the mature parts of that individual. So that was just a very brief overview of 13 different types of common therapeutic approaches. Now, it's confusing because no one approach fits all. So you might wonder, how do you come to decide which type of therapeutic approach is best for you? So this is completely down to you and the therapist. You might be drawn to a particular approach and you might seek out a therapist who can offer that approach, or you might seek out a therapist who specializes in something that you want help with, and then you might just be open to whatever type of approach they're recommending. What I would say is don't get too caught up in the type of approach that you are seeking out. Have an open mind, because the biggest indicator of success, according to lots of research, is actually the therapeutic relationship. So as long as you have a very strong therapeutic relationship where there's really good rapport with the therapist, and that you learn to trust that therapist over time, and you are confident that that therapist can guide you, and you've used your gut instinct to be able to decide whether they're the appropriate therapist for you, then it doesn't really matter what approach they're offering, as long as they're experienced in helping you with the issues that you're presenting with, and as long as they have the relevant type of training, they're not completely out of their depth when it comes to helping you with whatever difficulties you're facing or whatever treatment goals you have. So as I say, don't get too fixated on having a particular type of therapeutic approach, because good therapists are hard to find, and if you find a really good therapist who doesn't necessarily do the perfect approach for you, you might want to just test the water with them, have a few sessions, and use your gut instinct to see actually, is this a good fit? A good therapist, who might be a psychologist or a psychological therapist, will be trained in at least 2 evidence-based types of therapy. So don't forget to ask people where they've done their training and how many years postdoctoral training or post-qualification training they've received. You really want to ask those questions. And often, because I see a lot of British clients, they are far too polite to ask the questions about training. So people really need to get a bit braver with this one. Don't be afraid to ask your therapist, where did you train? When did you train? How many years did you train for? And how many years post-training are you now? And you can also ask your therapist if they've ever seen any clients before who has the same difficulties or treatment goals as you do. Don't be afraid to be assertive with your questions when choosing your therapist. You've every right to ask those questions before you decide who might be a good fit for you. If you've any questions about any of the therapeutic approaches in this video, feel free to put the comments below. And if you want to see more content from me, subscribe to my channel.